Okay. Let's go. Anisha, I'm connecting you. All right. How are you, Anisha? How's it going?
Hi Petro, I'm fine. How about you?
Wow, I love this energy. I'm super glad to meet you, and I hope everyone will enjoy this and ask some meaningful questions. Tell me
Okay.
if you're ready to rock, if you need some time to ramp up, or you gonna fire it straight away.
So I'll just introduce myself first, and then I'll just quickly share my screen and get started. Does that sound good?
Sure, that sounds amazing. I'm leaving, guys.
Okay.
I'm out.
Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Anisha, and I'm an associate software engineer at Red Hat, and I am here in software industry since last 2 years, and ever since then I have been using React and Redux. And recently I got into React hooks, and I kind of find it very simple and elegant. So today we're going to talk a little about React state management with hooks. So without any further delay, let's get started. And I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay. So why state management? Um, Yeah. So why state management, right? With an interactive web application, there is always a state, right? It's very important to understand whether we manage it or not. A state is always present in an interactive web application. So user perform an action, and things change in response to those actions. And state management just makes the that particular state of your application more tangible, maybe in a form of data structure, so that you can easily read and write to that, and kind of makes your invisible state clearly visible to you to work with for debugging or any reason for that matter. So rather than looking at the DOM and deducing state based on what is there and what is not, an explicit data structure is much easier to understand when we are creating larger and more complex JavaScript applications. So state management help us manage state and share it across between components, and be those components in the same hierarchy or nested hierarchy. Now, another aspect of it will be caching of data. So, if we store the data in a local state, or and the component unmounts, the data is completely gone, right? It's gone forever. And but if we want to preserve it in that life cycle and for uh, that session, it's important to have something that will help in caching. And now the next point is, it's always good to have a layout or view logic separated from the application logic flow, and it kind of keeps the whole system in structured way. Now, before getting into Redux and Hook stuff, just a quick overview of the evolution timeline of React state management. So React State was always there since the first release of React. We have been using it since 2013, and then after 1 year in 2014, Flux was introduced after Facebook showed issue with the typical MVC model, the framework that was getting used then, and Flux kind of fixed the state management issue with a unidirectional flow. And then in 2014, Redux came into the picture, and which updated the state with a centralized store. In 2017, React Fiber got introduced, which introduced task scheduling according to priority, which kind of made the process a little faster. And in 2018, we got context APIs where we could easily pass a prop from the parent component to a nested child component without moving it around within the unnecessary nested components where we didn't want to use them. And now we have hooks in React 16.8, and Yeah, that's the whole journey of React state management in short. Now, most of us might have used Redux already. I'll just quickly summarize it. Uh, so, what happens when we use Redux? Redux store data in a global store in a form called state, which is basically a JSON object, and it's a completely different setup. So contains the state. Now these states are defined in UI, and the UI over here is React component, and so states are used in UI for showing up data. Now, how does UI change the data stored in Redux? So it triggers something called an action, which is actually an object and have two keys, a type and a payload. Type is string defining the action, and payload is the value which need to be replaced with the old value in that particular state. Now, this action hits the reducer, which is a pure function, and the reducer updates the state in the store according to the logic written inside the reducers. So, a store basically contains different reducers with different logics and different states. So, so it makes it much more modular and structured, and this is the basic structure of data flow in Redux. Now, while using Redux, we have some benefits and some of the problems that most of us get into according to the use case that we try to solve. So Redux have this separation of logic, which lets us keep our concerns for different component separate, and even it separates the concerns from the component UI itself, and it's kind of a very good part of it. And of course, sharing data and is a big plus point of it, and it also helps caching data. It's easy to debug in Redux as well. Like whenever we make changes to store it, we will get a new object, and that's why we can keep the trace of the state before any action, and it makes the code structural. And as we have different setups for maintaining only one single task of the logic. So Redux also use middleware if we enable it, and it is an entity between action and reducer. We can use them for like maybe managing permission or interacting with APIs, etc. Now, the issue that we commonly face is like where to store the data. So we have session and local storage, or we can store the data inside the component as local state or as a global Redux store. So sometimes it gets messy to use these different things from for different tasks in the same system. And again, while using Redux, a lot of code needs to be written. Like if we're shifting our logic into something else, a functional component, then even the lines of code gets far more, and it has a very boilerplate becomes very large. And actually, it's difficult to learn the concept of Redux at once, and it takes time to understand the flow and concept of Redux as well, which makes it difficult to adopt. So we're done with the definition. Now coming to the problem statement. Imagine a scenario where you have to pass a prop uh, or to a nested component from the higher level component in hierarchy to to a lower level component. For example, we need to pass data from our component A to maybe component I and component G. So how do we do that? So the first thing is if the state is in a lower level, then we move the state logic to the higher level. Like for example, if the state is not present in component A but component B, we have to move the state logic to the component A, and it's called uplifting of the state. And then we pass on the value to every level of component tree, which is highly redundant. Like for this case, we have to pass it through component C, D, and B. So either we store data in local storage or centralized data store, which will fire an action to capture the state, or we use local component state and do state uplifting. So where we pass down the props at every level, which is absolutely redundant. So what's the solution? basically we need a way to declare the data that we want to be available throughout the component tree, right? So we need a way in which any component in the tree that requires a particular data, uh, the we should be able to access to it, should be able to subscribe to it. Now this is where React context comes into the picture. So what does context do? Context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at each level. So typically, when we create a new context for each unique piece of data that needs to be available with React create context instance. Now, this instance will have two parameters, both of which are components, a provider and a consumer. So, provider allows us to declare the data we want to be available throughout the component. It passes on the data that needs to be accessed in the nested component, and consumer allows any component in the tree to able to subscribe to that data, and without being able without like needing to pass it on to other components, and so that kind of makes it a little bit more functional. So let's move ahead with some examples. So in this example, what we are trying to do is we'll simply get a value from a higher hierarchy level component, and then we'll pass on that particular particular state to a nested component, right? So at first, I have created a component which creates an instance of uh, create a context named increase context, and then we export it to be used in the provider context. So here our top level component is app.js, which basically is a class component having a state which is count, a state having a value count, and in order to pass the value to any nested child component, we have to we have to use wrap the child component inside the context dot provider, and then pass on the value as an object with inside the value prop. And if you can see here, I'm just passing on some value of the count, and in order to consume that value, in order to consume that, in order to subscribe to that data whatever is passed from the provider, we need to use something, we need to export the context from where it is defined, and then uh, we need to wrap it around context.consumer, and then simply use the data that was passed. It will be available inside the consumer wherever we use it. So this is the basic flow of when we use the context with provider and consumer. So the provider provides the data, and the consumer consumes the data directly from the provider, and it at any point of the hierarchy in the component tree. Now, what if we just don't want to pass a value, but a function to update the value of the count, right? Like, what if we just don't want to pass a static value, or we want to change it as well in the nested component? Then the first intuition might be to pass a function with update with which updates the state inside the value. Like for example, here I have passed on the state count, and then I have passed on a function which simply updates the state count, and it will work as well. We'll As the previous example, we'll simply reference the both of the value passed inside context.consumer, and we'll be able to make it work as usual, as normal. And but it will have performance issues when the data passed inside a value prop will change. React will re-render every component which uses a consumer to subscribe to the data. So basically, every thing that will be attached to the provider will be changed. Every component which will be attached to the provider. So React will basically create different objects for every render and render of the provider component, as it will take every render as creation of a new object and will compare it to the old object. So basically, it will compare to the content of the object won't change, but it will compare the same object, same content with a new object with having same content, and it's called reference identity. So instead of passing on an object every time, we will pass the reference of the same object. So uh, here, for example, we instead of passing on the whole function, we kept the function inside the state and passed a reference to the state. So anywhere inside the component tree, we can now access the count and the increase count function values using consumers. So just a quick note that I'm using only two components just for sake of simplicity, but we can actually break down these components even in a more modular way as separate components. Like for example, we can make a separate component for creating these providers context or provider as well. So that completely is up to you. Now what if we have multiple providers, like we want to collect data from different components and consuming all the context at the same place. If that happens, then uh, the render prop in the consumer is kind of hard to follow. For example, here I have used two different contexts, the increase context and default context. So basically, the increase context simply increases the count, but default context give a default value. But basically, I have declared both of them over here. But we can actually use different components from where we will export these contexts. So the in that case, in provider, we have to nest the provider and then send value as we were doing before. Like for example, here the increase context of provider and the default context is nested inside it, and we have wrapped the nested component is wrap the nested component over here, which is increase, right? But if you see the way consumer consumes the data over here is kind of weird. Like uh, now we have nested increase context, and then it's returning some value, and then again we have default context and it's returning some value. So with more and uh, more context, it becomes more and more complicated, right? And here we have used only two context, and if you want to use like multiple context, and we want to have different state values inside our nested component, it's going to be very complicated. So excuse me. So this is where hooks comes into rescue. With all the nesting thing going on, when we have like a lot of multiple values passed inside the provider, hooks makes it easier to follow in the consumer part, right? So before getting into the example, a little bit information about hooks. Hooks are new addition to React 16.8. They let us use state and other React features without writing class. So basically, you put your functions on catalysts so that you can uh, stop relying on classes and to move on to functions. So if you prefer classes over functions, then it is a different story. But sooner or later, you'll have to dive into hooks to introduce your own logic into functions in a simpler way. So hooks are basically like functions which hook into React state and lifecycle features from functional components. It does not work inside classes. So basically, if you write functional component and then you want to add some state to it, previously you do it by converting it to class component, which even I have done it before in before examples. So The thing is that that's not required. That's the whole point of it. So if you don't need to complex class components, it's a good way to you move on to hooks and use functional components, right? And the good news is hooks are backward compatible, which means it's not going to break any changes. Also, it doesn't replace our knowledge of React, like replace the knowledge of our React concepts. So the basic prerequisites will be like we need to use Node version 6 or above, and NPM version 5.2 or above, and a tool like create React app for running the React app. Now, there are three basic hooks for state changes and a couple of additional hooks as well. For this session, we will deal with use context, use state, and use reducers. So, why do use hooks? We know that components and top-down data flow help us organize a large UI into small, independent, reusable chunks of code. However, we often can't break complex component down any further because the state is the logic is so stateful and also can't be extracted to a function or another component. So that's huge concern. When we try to solve these use cases with components alone, we usually end up with either huge components that are hard to refactor and test, or duplicated logic between different components and lifecycle methods. And same thing will be happening in both, but unnecessarily, we will have to write code like render props and like render props and high order components. So, hooks let us organize the logic inside a component into reusable isolated units, and we can have our logic fixed somewhere and then use it again and again in different components. So, now I am moving on with the same example. So all the nesting in the consumer side will just go away with the use of simple hook use context. We just simply reference the context using use context and use the value to get the state and or the data that we wanted to use inside the component. Now, we see you see previously we were using class component, but actually the thing is it was not required. We didn't have that much the function to we didn't want the UI logic to we didn't have that much UI or application logic to use the class components, and it was not stateful. So we are going to eliminate the class component from here, and we'll convert the nested component increased.js to functional component and use hooks, right? So, but see, we are still using class component in app.js, and we are tracking. We're tracking these state with state, and to emulate this behavior, we can actually emulate this in a even simpler way with React hooks. So we don't need to get into class component. We can do it in a much more elegant and simple way by using use state hook. So, uh, what does calling use state do? It declares a state variable, uh, kind of eliminates the whole constructor and super keyword stuff, and just simply uses the use state in just a couple of 2 or 3 lines. So in this example, I have taken a simple button which will click will increase the count, and for that I have simply exported the use state and then imported the use state, and then the use state then returns a tuple where the first parameter count is the current state of the counter, and the set count is the method that will allow us to update the counter state. So we can use the set count method to update the state count anywhere inside this component, and in case and we can actually like we can actually change this current state to anything. And here inside the set count function, I'm simply increasing it by 1. So, and when we want to display the current count in the class, we read this dot state dot count previously in the class component, and now we can simply just wrap the variable inside curly braces, and that's it. So the idea with hooks is that we are able to keep our code more functional, elegant, and avoid class based component if it's not desired or needed. So if we can make it simple, so it's better kept simple. Now, to use the set state in our previous example where we used context, we simply removed the constructor and super keyword and converted app.js component to functional component, and used the count and set count tuple to keep track of state variable, and pass this in the value in the provider so that the consumer can have a can access to it. Right now the code works the same way as before, but the lines of code, the chunks of code is reduced significantly, and that's I guess the beauty of it. So now another thing is, what if we want to create multiple actions or even more complicated logic, even though we can actually create more set reference and pass them down. But the best approach to do it is use of another hook called use reducer. So use reducer hook is basically an alternative to use state. It accepts a reducer object with which will keep track of the state according to the type of action passed and initial value of the state. So if you are familiar with Redux syntax, then it might be more you might understand it even in a better way. So it's kind of very simple actually. So basically, as usual, we use the use Redux hook. You can actually import it over on top of it. I don't know why I didn't do it here. So it returns a tuple as usual, which uh, keeps track of the current state, and then it returns us uh, another function dispatch, which points to a function reducer. So what reducer does is it keeps track of the action type, and according to that it changes the state, right? So when we use this reducer, we simply dispatch an action type to the reducer function over here, and according to the action type it determines what thing to do with the state. So React, the use reducer is usually preferable to use that when we have complex state logic that involves multiple subvalues, or even the next state depends on the previous one, right? So now we can emulate the exact same functionality in different nest in our previous example. So we simply created the context, in case context, and in order to pass the value, we passed a tuple with the action dispatch, and in the consumer side we'll be able to use dispatch function, and do the same thing that it will do the same it will be able to get the data passed from the higher hierarchical component, and it will do the thing as per your logic. So uh, so we can emulate the exact functionality in different nested components by simply passing the dispatch function inside the value object of the provider. So Historically, how we have structured out React component has been coupled to component life cycles. This kind of forced related logic throughout the component doing the same thing. Before React hooks, when we want to create dynamic component, we had to create a class component and use lifecycle methods to change states to make it usable or make it encapsulate. By creating an ES6 class, the class needs to get extended by React.component and with a render method inside it, which will return a JSX markup. Also, we need to assign to initiate a state, we need to assign the initial state in the constructor with this dot state. So whereas in hooks, use state hooks allow you to add state in uh, yeah, allows to use initial state with this dot state dot statement in the constructor, and well, we can import use state from React, which will allow you to set the initial state in the argument. So comparing these two comparing these ways to create a component, we can clearly see that hooks need comparatively very less amount of code, and it is more clear to read and understand, and definitely provides sharing non-visual logic implementation. Right. So now, uh, some of the pointers about using context and hooks will be like when to use hooks. So uh, we need hooks are kind of we can use hooks for simpler logic when we don't need middleware, where we have easy and straightforward logic, and we don't need much of the server side rendering. And uh, the advantages of it is it's a module level store, and you like we can use it only when it is required, and it's very easy to move around the logic in hooks, and doesn't replace the previous knowledge of React concept, and get far less amount of code, and it's more structured. So a couple of disadvantages, or I should say that it's kind of depends on the use case, that there is no middleware support, and if you want to have a lot of server side rendering, that's kind of not possible, and we can't do time travel debugging, so debugging becomes difficult, and context hooks have a lot of render cycles, so it might impact the performance as well, and context can only store a single value. So now, where to use hooks context? Uh, Even though in the example we used hooks in component level, we should prefer to use context providers in router level, I feel. Now, why am I saying it? Because it will reduce the re-renders and hence improving the performance. Now, we can also try to do it with React Memo, but by keeping it at a router level, we will be able to get all providers at a single place, and all routes using provider can be easily pointed out. So there are a couple of rules we need to keep in mind while dealing with hooks. We can't call hooks from regular JavaScript functions. It should always be called from React functional components, and we shouldn't call hooks inside loops, conditions, nested functions, and we all should always use hooks at the top level of the React function. So by following this rule, we ensure that hooks are called in the same order each time a component renders. That's what allows React to correctly preserve the state of hooks between multiple use state and use effect calls. Now, so some of the best practices of hooks is custom hook is a JavaScript function uh, that whose name starts using use, and that may call other hooks. For example, we can combine some of the basic hooks and create a custom hooks. So keeping should call all like try to call hooks from custom hooks, and keeping React hooks simple will give us more power to effectively control and manipulate what goes on in a component throughout the lifetime. So and avoid writing custom and you know uh, so if we don't need to use like multiple hooks, then we should definitely avoid using custom hooks, and we can simply use an inline hook instead. So that depends on what is your use case and what kind of logic you want to put in. So it's basically, the whole idea is to keep it as simple as possible. And one advantages of React hooks is the ability to write less code that is easy to read. In some cases, the amount of uh, hooks like use effect and use state can still be confusing. When you keep a component organized, it will help in readability and keep the flow of the component consistent and predictable. If the custom hooks are too complicated, you can always break them out into sub custom hooks as well. So extract the logic of your component into custom hooks to make the code readable, but don't use just for fun. I mean, if you can do it with in a simpler way, then it's good to go with that. Now, a React Hook snippet is a Visual Studio Code extension to make React hooks easier and faster. So they currently support, I think, 5 hooks. So definitely uh, try it out. And VS Code plugin called ES plugin React hooks enforces the rules that was mentioned in the previous slide. This comes in handy in enforcing the rules when working on a project. So I suggest you make use of these plugins when working on your project, especially when working with others. You can add this plugin to your project if you would like to try it. Now, these are some reference and conferences talks I used to get a good idea about like how to use hooks and context for state management. So definitely go check it out. I'll put the slide link in the comment section. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. It was a really amazing experience. It was actually my first international conference, so I was kind of excited and nervous at the same time. But I guess thank you for being an amazing audience and a host. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. Can you turn on your webcam? Okay, I got it. I got it. So it's so bright in here. Let me just tell that we are having a Q&A session. It's planned to be in 3 minutes. So before those 3 minutes, I would like to ask you the question. How do you feel? The general question. I'll be asking this to everyone, guys. So if you're a speaker watching me right now, just prepare your speech, write it down, write down the scenario, the true one. How do you feel about the conference and how's it going for you?
So I think I enjoyed preparing the slides even more. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. I mean, I saw some of the comments, and I tried to put it in a way where we build up the scenario one by one instead of going directly to the thing. I mean, the whole idea was to even if somebody who is not familiar with the concept should be able to follow in from even the middle of the slide. So I don't know how I did it. So yeah, we'll see
Nice.
about we'll see that.
Nice. Let me show you something. Just pull it up real quick. We start with thank you by Chris Ward. Then we go straight to Caitlin Loon. And she says, thank you so much for the helpful information. I hope you find this voice actually not boring. Okay, we got Pavel here. Pavel is a moderator for Senior Track. He's my teammate. He want to say something, say hello,
Hey
say
guys,
hi.
hey, nice to have you all here.
Yeah, so just in the next room, we have a senior track, and we got this guy who is a moderator there. So, hello, guys, from Pavel, and my name is Petro.
Yeah.